from the Palm Springs Book Festival, with John Dean, author of Worse Than Watergate, Umberto Fontova, author of Fidel, Hollywood's Favorite Tyrant, and Susan McDougall, author of The Woman Who Wouldn't Talk. It's an hour.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming here. We're delighted you could join us for a discussion. I'd like to introduce the other members of the panel at this time. On the left here is John Dean. John was counsel to the president when Richard Nixon was president, and he was right there when all the Watergate business went on. He is an author. He wrote at the time a stunning bestseller called Blind Ambition. It's out of print now, but it's going to be reissued shortly. His latest book is available here. It's Worse Than Watergate. And in it, John talks about the secrecy of the present administration and of the potential problems that can cause both the administration and the country. Next to John and next to me on my right here is Umberto Fontova. Umberto was born in Cuba and came to this country when he was 7 years old. He has written a book that's a fascinating study of the history of the last 40 years of Cuba and Fidel Castro. And on my left is the charming and beautiful Susan McDonald. McDougall. See? I'm so overcome by her beauty and charm. Susan, as you know, is a woman of great courage, and I have a great deal of admiration for her. And she's someone who has stood up for principle. We all think we would like to do that. But when it got real tough, she stood up for her principles and went to prison and never blanched once in the face of incredible threats and bullying by Kenneth Starr and the Independent Counsel Office in Whitewater. Our topic for discussion this afternoon is it time for a new political party? Those of you who are familiar with my book know that, in my opinion, it is that time. Both the Republican and Democratic parties, I feel, have failed the American people and have brought us policies which are very dangerous and are leading the country in the wrong direction. I think it was put well by a Republican senator from Arizona, John McCain, when he was running for president in 2000, said about the people who are running the country, he said, "The huge multinational corporations and the major campaign contributors own this country." He said they are in fact more powerful than the government itself. And that's because they have given continually over the years hundreds of millions of dollars to both Democrats and Republicans because they have their own special agenda and their own special interests to protect. Those policies, in my opinion, have led us to disastrous foreign and domestic policy problems. We have the war in Iraq, we have terrorism, we have an energy shortage, we have a healthcare system that's failing millions of people and whose costs are escalating out of control. We have a tax system that makes you and I and wage earners pay the biggest part of the income tax burden, while these huge corporations can cut back on jobs and manufacturing in this country, make billions of dollars, and pay no profits. These are some of the reasons why I think it's time for a new party. Let's hear from some others. Susan?
You know, I hadn't really thought about a third party. I have been disappointed in the Republican Party, as you know, and fought them since I really became involved personally in politics after Whitewater. I really hadn't, I grew up in Arkansas. It was a Democratic state. Everyone I knew was a Democrat. We all thought we were right. And so when the Republicans did what they did during Whitewater, I thought, you know, these are bad people. This is a terrible thing to have happened to our government, and I stood up against it. But in Whitewater, I saw a lot of Democrats that I was pretty ashamed of too, that didn't stand up for what was right, who ran at the first sign of trouble. And during the last campaign, I was terribly disappointed. I thought that John Kerry, although he had been someone I had always admired, who had stood up after the Vietnam War and said what was on his heart, that he thought the war was wrong, that he had seen the things that, you know, no American should be a party to, didn't stand up against the war in Iraq and went instead to try to get votes. And so I was terribly disappointed with my party again. And even though I do hope that we can make those changes within the Democratic Party, and I want to be a part of those changes, I do agree that somehow we've lost our footing. I mean, all of those things that he talked about, the lack of health care, the lack of jobs, the moral ambiguity that we are pressed with every day over who is a Christian and who is not, and what is right and what is wrong, really has set me to thinking, especially, I live in a really small town in Arkansas now, and so when you live in a small place and you know everybody, you can see the ravaging effects of what he's talking about every day when kids are sick and can't go to the doctor. And I know these people and I live with them in a very small place. And so I am terribly disappointed in our government and in politics as a rule. You know, Vince Foster, who was a huge part of Whitewater, left a note in his briefcase that I think is so telling. And you might remember what it said. He said, "Politics in this town have become a blood sport." And really, the fighting in politics and the division that political leaders have really made this country feel that we are not together, that we are fighting one another in ways that we have never looked at before, I think is letting us down as just American citizens. And I'm certainly not the specialist that these men are, but I know that in your heart you all feel that. I've been to Palm Springs before and we've talked about how we feel our government is letting us down, and maybe it is time for a third party. I'm open to that because I know that we all feel disappointment in who is serving us at this point in time. I know that I do.
Thank you, Susan. Humberto, let's hear from you and get your views here.
I move my hands a lot when I talk because I'm Spanish, so
you can't hold that.
But I think they'll be able to hear me. But I'm in favor of anything that will erode political apathy, because the gentleman that you see on the cover of my book took power in a country because of political apathy. I am viciously critical in this book of the Democratic administration of JFK for locking him into power and pulling out the rug from the Cuban freedom fighters. But however, prior to that, it was the people of Cuba who were taken by surprise by Fidel Castro. There was a tendency among Cuba's middle and upper class at the time, well, man, that's politics. You know, we don't worry about that. We kind of leave that up to the United States. And it was obvious to Cuba's middle and upper classes that the U.S. State Department was backing Fidel Castro, the rebel, against Fulgencio Batista, the Cuban president of the time. President. He had stolen an election, but he was every bit the president that they call President Castro now. So the Cubans tended to go, well, heck, the Americans must know what they're doing. You even had the CIA funding Castro's rebel movement. And you had the State Department, and you actually had the State Department that gave Cuban President Fulgencio Batista his walking papers. So Cubans said, they must know what they're doing, you know. And when Castro started his nationalizations and his mass incarcerations, that, you know, point is, he caught us by surprise, my parents' generation, by surprise, and it was because of a certain amount of political apathy. So anything, because of what I've seen, the horrors that have overtaken Cuba, anything that will erode political apathy, that will cause people to look closer at the issues and who's running, I'm in favor of.
Thank you very much. John, you've been involved in politics at the very highest level. What are your thoughts here?
Since I'm not sure if that little mic is working. First, let me comment on this apathy issue, which is an important issue. During the 2000 campaign, I happened to be surfing on the dial and noticed that during the various campaign coverages, which is less and less, but I did notice one reporter interviewing a first-time delegate at the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia. And the reporter asked this fella, "Why are you active in this campaign and in this convention for the first time? What drove you?" And he said, "Well, there's a highway going through my backyard." And I think that pretty well describes what it takes to get people involved in the process often. Something where they feel it very personally and that they realize that their vote and their activity and their campaign participation seems to draw out their citizenship. Otherwise, we tend to rely on our representatives to do it for us. But let's go to your general premise on this third party or a new party. The last time I counted, there were something like 63 minor parties. There are two dominant, obviously. There are 3 that have qualified for ballot, in addition to the Republicans and the Democrats: the Constitutional Party, the Green Party, and the Libertarians. Ballot control in every state dictates who can participate and who cannot. So if you talk about a new party, you've got to really talk about changing at least 50 state laws for openers. Now, the other parties, the some 60 other I'm referring to, which run from the American Nazi Party to the Communist Party is still active, exactly. They've not been able in recent decades to come close to qualifying anybody to get them on a ballot, on a national ballot. But there still have been regional parties that have had an impact in their region on national politics. Up in the state of Washington, for example, for years, the Libertarian Party up there had a huge impact on what happened both locally and somewhat influenced nationally. So we do have other parties. And as I read your book, for example, and looking particularly everything you had listed in the boxes as, excuse me, of a platform that you would design, virtually every one of those issues is being covered. In fact, if you look closely at both the Republicans and the Democrats, you see that they're nothing but tents, which you have a lot of schisms. And what's holding the Republicans together today seems to be their almost unanimous dislike of anything they call liberal or anything that might cost them the White House. Because your schisms, particularly, only something like a little less than 40% of the Republican Party is really truly conservative. And that hard right now, particularly the religious right, is wagging the entire dog, as we know. And this is a perfect example of what people can do with the existing party structure, because I'm somebody who've watched the religious right for a long time. Watched them back in the late 70s, watched them learn from their mistakes. When they failed at one level, they didn't pack up their bags and go home. They went out at it again and figured out how to deal with a problem. They went into localities, they started at school boards, and literally worked their way up. And it's a perfect example of how to, in essence, take over a party so that your base becomes so important that the leaders can't dispense with it. So I think if we're ever going to have any change in the parties, it's going to have to come within those existing tents. There's a long Anglo-Saxon tradition, both from England and here, of having basically a dual party, sort of a dialectic. And I don't think that's going to change, and I don't think anybody could change it, even if we should change it. So those are my opening thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Of course, the history of third parties in this country is that we've had a lot of them over the history of the entire politics. But in most cases, a third party arose because of a single issue that was predominant at that time. For example, slavery, or women's suffrage, or the direct election of senators. There were all parties that took up the cudgels on this issue. And once that issue was absorbed in the two-party system that John's talking about, one of the parties adopted it, it became policy, it was no longer radical, and the reason for the existence of the third party went away. I'd like to talk about the apathy a little bit that Humberto talks about. In this country, when we were first founded, about 75 to 80% of the registered voters, qualified voters, went to the polls. In recent presidential elections, it's been hard to get 50%. Now, is that because of an apathy among the voters, or is it because they're disenchanted with both parties and what they see, or is it because they feel helpless? What is the reason? Why aren't the people voting? The ones who do go out to vote may be urged to the polls by these emotional issues like abortion and gun control and gay marriage. But what is the problem? What's the basic problem?
You know, I talked to a lot of people during the election who didn't vote, mostly because they didn't really think it made any difference. And one of those reasons was that they were working all the time. The women I talked to were working 2 and 3 jobs, and they had kids at home that were being kept by babysitters that they were trying to keep, and they were busy, and they were just trying to put food on the table. And I think that it's sort of been one of the objects of the Republican Party to make people who would not vote for them in many cases so hungry, so needy of a job, so worried about their day-to-day existence that politics is somewhere out there. They don't read about it, they don't care about it, they don't want to know who's running because they just have a daily struggle for life. And there are a lot of Americans in that situation that I see all the time. Now, I think young people really think that politics is outdated. They really do think, because they're more educated, they're more computer-oriented than my generation, that multinationals do run the country, and that really these people that put themselves out as the candidates aren't really the candidates at all. It's somebody else who's doing it, and they're run by other companies. But having known Bill Clinton personally, as someone from a small state, and I grew up knowing who he was, I can tell you that one person can make a huge difference. And I am very proud of the Clinton presidency. I like him. I think he cares about people. Thank you. I can trash the Democratic Party, but then I can look again and see some of the really great things that Clinton did during his presidency and be proud of that more people worked, that more kids had medical care under Clinton than ever before. In the state of Arkansas, the hunger levels were just astronomical when he began his presidency, and they went down considerably. And we were at peace, and we had this huge amount of money left over in the Treasury, at the end of his presidency. So he did do some really great things as an individual, because I think being someone who was from a small place, whose mother worked for a living, whose father was an alcoholic, and he knew the pressures that we're all under. I mean, he knew what it was to see a mother go out and try to put food on the table. And so I don't think that we should be discouraged, but I know that people are. And I think there's so many reasons of the people that I talk to. And I love that these books are being written and that people are talking about it more, because we have got to go out and vote and take back our power.
I want to make one point about what John said about the two parties. I think there's nothing immutable or permanent about the two parties. They have changed in the past. We've always had a two-party system, but the parties have changed. And recent public opinion polls in the last 15 years show that anywhere from 35 to 40% of the American people think we need a new political party. Now, I don't know who those people are. Are they conservative Democrats who are fiscally sensitive to issues? Are they moderate Republicans who don't like a lot of what they see? But there are a lot of people in this country who are unhappy, and the question is, how can we do something about that unhappiness and deal with those problems?
Well, I would want to say, getting back to the you want to take it? No. But getting back to the apathy thing just for a second, because it hit me. Cuban Americans were apathetic about politics in Cuba. Well, Cubans were. Cuban Americans are not apathetic about politics in the United States. Every election, You hear about, the crucial Cuban-American vote. Oh, my goodness. And then every candidate is down in Miami, Viva Cuba Libre, and down with Castro. Why is it? There's only 2 million Cuban-Americans in this country. What is the issue? Why is everybody so excited about their vote? They all vote. They don't all vote. About 90% of them vote. Mostly Republican, but we do vote. And
several times.
Huh? No, come on, no, not several times. They vote because we got whacked on the side of the head in Cuba. And, it reminds me of the famous Joni Mitchell song, "Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone?" Well, we lost it in Cuba. We regained it here, for which we're very grateful, and we do our part in the political process.
Susan, we had the best turnout of young voters in 2004 that we've had. It was really encouraging, and it splits about 50-50. A little bit more Democratic vote on the young people than Republican. Interestingly, Republicans are much better at getting out the vote than Democrats. This has been historical. The statistics show this. Republicans, last time, as you know, made the decision to play to their base and really rely on their base to put the president back in. It worked. Although there was a real drive to get Democrats to the poll, and probably one of the better organized, in fact, the turnout was, relatively speaking last time, good. As far as when you get down and start scratching beneath the numbers as to why people do or do not vote, there are combinations of apathy, the fact that people are busy and it's not easy to go to the polls. They don't get absentee ballots. Had the highest use of absentee ballots in the last election we ever had. But when you really look at our system, and this is really from day one, our laws, our state laws, and our Constitution says each state will determine the laws for elections in that state, federal and state elections. They're hostile to voters. Absolutely hostile. They make registration difficult. If you take a plan to Washington to make registration just a slam dunk so that anybody could register quickly and easily, it will get voted down every time. The vested interests don't like to make it too easy. And this has been part of the problem. The system is rigged against the voter in many regards. You have to go through a process. And we also know for years the system certainly discriminated against black voters, and terribly so. So, as I say, when you look at, even though our claims of democracy, we don't do very good on delivering. I've kind of enjoyed, from an analytical standpoint, watching the election in Iraq, where initially it was announced maybe 70 to 80% of the people who were eligible had voted. That's absolutely untrue. Absolutely untrue. They say now, at best, it was like maybe 55 to 58%. And so it wasn't a great turnout. And of course, a large segment of the population never showed up at the polls. And those who did are just carrying on and only voting for their own religious groups. The American-backed candidates got something like 10% of the vote. So you can't always impose the system either.
Thank you, John. The apathy issue is one that I think it's very difficult to deal with, because you have the problem of access of the public to information. And John, of course, has written about this in his last book, Worse Than Watergate. To have an informed electorate which votes intelligently, you have to have knowledge, you have to have information. And there's a serious question now whether we're getting all of that information. I see that President Bush spoke to the American Association of Publishers Thursday and stated that he and his administration stood firmly on the side of publicity and public government and no secrecy in the government. Now, that may come as a surprise to those of you who've read all the details in John's book. But what is the answer here? In other countries around the world, the voting percentage of the population goes as high as 95%. Now, it's true in some countries like Australia, they provide that unless you vote and can prove you voted, you're not eligible for any government benefit of any kind. That tends to motivate the voters. But even without that kind of a provision, other countries do better than we do. There's got to be a reason why. What is it?
Let me pick that back up since you raised the book. Since you raised the issue of the informed public, and indeed this does influence how people vote, in writing the update for the paperback edition of the book, which is just now coming out on Worse Than Watergate, one of the things I looked at was the voting practice, particularly what had happened in a study that just blew me away. It came out just about the time of the election. The polling was done the week before people went to the vote, and to determine the level of knowledge of voters. What did they know about their candidates? Well, something like 75% of the people who were going to vote for Bush believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that was the reason to go to war. Or there was a tie to Al-Qaeda. Something like 23% of the Kerry voters had that misimpression. You just go through all this data, and it is startling how little voters actually know. Now, it's hard to get below the reasons. It's to me something other. I'm somebody who has the greatest trust in a collective judgment. Juries, this audience, if you poll them and what have you, that collective wisdom, I think, is valuable. But if they don't have the information upon which to base the judgment, then it's a faulty judgment. And when I began digging a little deeper, the reason that these people had such misinformation was this is what they were being told in their churches. And they were told this was the way it is, and nobody questioned their ministers. So they went out and voted. And what's quite interesting is once you give people the facts, as they did in this study, it shows they were almost identical, and the American people come out right in the middle. We are not really a red and blue nation. It's like a bell curve. The leaders are on these fringes, but the bulk of the American people reside right in the middle.
The frightening thing about the dissemination of information is that I saw a poll about 6 months ago that said 70% of the American people do not read a book or get their news from a newspaper. Now, I'll bet in this room everyone reads a book. How many people in this room have not read a book or a newspaper in the last year? See, no one. You're not the average American public. And the same poll indicated that about 40% of those who got their news from television got it from Fox News Network. So that gives you some idea of the basis of it. Well, John, I take it, has a somewhat pessimistic view of the possibility or the practicality of a new third party, because he points out quite rightfully that both the Republican and Democratic parties have passed laws in all 50 states that make it very difficult to qualify the candidates of another party for the ballot. And we all know, of course, the problems with the presidential debates. Third-party minority candidates are always trying to get on there, and they can't, because those debates are run by a committee of 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. But something can be done. What can be done? How do we get rid of the apathy that was so dangerous in Cuba, and I think is equally dangerous here? I think we can do it if we can get the people talking about this, if they can get active at a community level and do something. Now, as John said, there are many third parties now. There are about 6 or 7 that have appeared on the ballots of more than 5 or 10 states in the past. I'm going to try to do something about this. I'm inviting the leaders of the Reform Party and Green and Libertarian and Peace and Freedom, American Constitution, American Independent Party, to a conference here in Palm Springs in early June to sit down and see if they can talk realistically. Now, they believe in many of the issues that we all talk about as being important in foreign policy, but they all have little side issues, little things they feel very strongly about and emotionally about. And as long as they persist in those and pursuing those ideas, my theory is that they will never get public acceptance. But we're going to try to see if we could get these people to agree on a few simple policies. Maybe it's foreign policy, multilateralism versus preemptive invasions. Maybe it's health care, universal health care instead of the present system. Maybe it's reform of the tax system. Would something like that work? Is there any hope of getting these people to unite to be a more effective voice?
I think the media is going to play a big part in that as well, access to the media, because I know that you can be frozen out of a dialogue very easily by not being able to get on television or on radio. And if you don't have that access, your story is not told. One of the reasons all of you know who I am and that I was able to tell my story so effectively is that it was really before the age of Fox that my story came out, and I was given the opportunity to talk to all of you and just to tell my story in a very open forum. Larry King Live, for instance, a live program where they can't edit you and where you tell what you believe and you're able to talk to people. Almost it feels one-on-one, you know, to be able to talk to you. And I think if you got all those people together and they had a charismatic leader who really had a firm grasp of what people needed in this country and wanted, and he had access to the media that wasn't a show like, you know, Hannity, where he gets on and he shouted down and you can't even hear the words he had to say, but a thoughtful process of media that he could actually touch people's hearts and bring people's minds along with him. I don't know why it couldn't happen, that people would respond to that and that it would work.
Unless we have some more comments up here, I'm going to see if we have any questions from the audience. Anything you want to add or ask any of us about? Yes, sir. Wait a second till we get a microphone to you so we can all hear your question, please.
First of all, I wish to thank the panel members because they've done an outstanding job in bringing to our attention issues that are important to all of us. However, with all due respect to them, I think one of the things that needs to be addressed is the growing power, as the moderate leader has just mentioned at the opening of the panel, the growing power of the multinational corporations and their influence on our congressional representatives, where now the voices of the people are losing power. We are losing, matter of fact, people's democracy is diminishing rapidly. We miss people like Thomas Jefferson, we miss people like Abraham Lincoln, who brought to the attention of the people of that time the need to unify our country. We do not hear unifying voices out there. We hear partisan voices. And what we're also hearing is a lack of what the lady had mentioned, access to the media. They are controlling our thoughts. They are controlling the economy. So we have to make a strong effort to revive a people's democracy through united efforts, like a consumer movement that involves all of the people in between the two classes that are growing now, the lack of the middle classes. Thank you.
Well, you're quite right. The people don't have a voice anymore, and it's because the media doesn't broadcast that voice. The media, 50 years ago, there were over 60 companies that owned all the radio stations and newspapers in the country. Today, there are less than a dozen, really, that own the major ones. But the President and the Congress aren't going to listen to you and me because we didn't give $50 million, for example, in the last presidential election to Republican and Democratic candidates for the presidency and the House and the Senate. Now, those oil companies did that because they want a voice. They want to be heard, and they are being heard. Next week, the House of Representatives in Washington is going to discuss the rest of the energy bill that the government's proposing. Now, you all heard that they voted a couple of weeks ago to commence drilling in the National Arctic Refuge. Well, part of this new energy bill that's being debated and urged is a proposed solution to our energy shortage. And you know what that solution is? It is additional tax breaks for the oil and gas companies, which gave the $50 million in the campaign. Now, they really need this, because I noticed yesterday, I saw a release that said Chevron, Texaco's net operating profit last year was only $13 billion, up from $1 billion 2 years ago, 13 times what it was. So that's the voice that's heard in Washington. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
John wants to answer.
One of the things in writing Worse Than Watergate that I looked at is how could it be that all the secrecy that I spotted so soon and so early wasn't being noticed, particularly by the news media, which has always been at the forefront of dealing with government secrecy. There are two groups, really, news people and scientists. Scientists need to share information, they need open government to share information, and so they have been in the forefront along with the news media. So I thought maybe this is corporate consolidation of the news media. I began asking reporters, particularly when I was out touring with the book, talked to lots of reporters. And one of the conclusions I came to is, with rare exception, and this surprised me, because I thought probably it was coming from on top, but with rare exception, particularly in the print media, is a direction coming from on high as to how to cover a given story. What's happening is they're so bottom line oriented that news people, journalists, have so little time to develop stories. What many told me, they said, John, we don't have the time to do what you did, to talk to all the people, to dig up all the stories, to dig below the surface. We just don't have that luxury anymore. We no longer have a chance for a Woodward and Bernstein having one assignment only. If the comparable story were to be covered today, they would be on it and off it and on to something else. They wouldn't be able to stay focused on it. And that's really, as much as anything, the impact of the corporate consolidation. But I happen to be one that believes it'll be broken up sooner rather than later.
And then of course, you have the element of not only time to devote to it, but it's much easier for a newsman to talk about the Monica Lewinsky story than it is to talk about how to reform the complicated tax code. Let's have a question. This lady over here has had her hand up. The microphone's on its way.
Yes, I do agree with you about how we do have a high sense of apathy within our electorate and how people don't vote. But I also feel as though people have given away their power, and again, power in our country is basically monetary. And I'd like your comment regarding my feeling, is that if more people would spend their dollars in a more smart way, such as, like I said, I mean, I'm amazed at how there isn't a huge uproar about how we're paying $2.68, almost $3 a gallon. I mean, personally, I've chosen to ride a bus, I walk, I bike ride. These are the sorts of things, in my opinion, that people need to take back their power. Again, multinational companies would not have money if we didn't give it to them, if we didn't buy their products. And I'd like your comment regarding that.
I think you're right. We all say we want to do something about it, but when it comes right down to it, we get in our car to drive the meeting instead of walking or riding the bicycle or making an effort. Yes, sir, you had your hand up.
And I just have a comment. I very much disagree with starting a new party in this country. It's a waste of time, energy, and everything else. However, I think one of the things that we could do regarding media to get the news out for us is to support independent media There's Pacifica radio station nationwide. There are plenty of independent media groups within Palm Springs as well as Greater Los Angeles. And so maybe you can elaborate how we can get away from corporate media that in a Ben Bagdikian book, Media Monopoly, there are only 5 or 4 big corporations now that runs everything. What can we do to resurface the independent media that we really need in this country to get the information out?
John, do you want to comment on
that? The potential that I've not heard mentioned surprisingly on this panel, and it is having a dramatic impact, is the internet. It is the new media. It is affecting everything in campaigning, from fundraising to getting the message out. Bloggers are now calling to task the mainstream media, finding errors. Dan Rather will tell you about that. It's really a way for people, everybody in this audience can get on and blog, if you will. And the better their blog, the more people they'll draw to it. So good information will attract attention, will gather a following. So I don't think it's the information, and I say it's easy to come up with what I feel are kind of simplistic answers to very complex problems. And by saying, oh, it's the big media, or the fact, there's no question that campaign contributions are totally out of hand, and that Washington is a trough where elected officials go and collect their handful, and needless to say, to me, it's always been the line between bribery and a campaign contribution is nothing more than what you call it. And if you call it a campaign contribution, it's finer than a frog's hair, as far as I'm concerned. So we do need to address that. We have only begun to. And the fact that the nation now is particularly in the House of Representatives, the way it's set up with these safe seats, not just in California, in almost every state, only like 30% of, not even, I think, excuse me, about 30 members of the House of Representatives are the only seats that are ever contested. This is just really shows the lack of concern about the basic fundamental principles of democracy. And if people, as this woman said, and as you've said, do exercise their power, trust me, the government will react.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something about the alarming statistics about where people get their news, because I saw something that was even more alarming. I forget the exact percentage, but it was something like 60% of Americans got it from Entertainment Weekly, you know? Entertainment Weekly, and you'll notice that very shrewdly I put Hollywood on the title of my book. So I'm doing my part. But that would explain why the Woodwards and Bernsteins, you know, aren't getting the hearing and the sex scandals are. I mean, who's leading who here? The networks have a bottom line, just like C-SPAN has a bottom line, Palm Springs has a bottom line. If that's what the people want, what are you going to do? You know, at least try to spice it up a little bit.
Yes, sir. Right up there.
Thanks. I don't want to negate any of the fine points that you've made, but I wanted to step back from them just for a moment, because I think all people, regardless of their intellect or educational ability, have the capacity to know BS when they hear it. I knew, Susan, from day one that you were telling the truth. I knew in 1974 that Richard Nixon was a liar. My question is, since I do think all human beings have this ability, it appears to me that we in America have become very dissociated from that we don't trust our own perceptions on long lines of truth versus untruth. And every day I see things that happen in the media that cause me to say, whoa, wait a minute, is anybody paying attention here? Do you see this situation as I do? And do you see any way of empowering us to simply listen to our own intuitive guidance.
I love that you said that, and it really means a lot to me. In my situation, in my story, let me tell you, I was so proud of this country when during the impeachment, all of the House managers were saying these things about Clinton. He was being impeached. It was a national disgrace. But what did the people say? Just like you said, they knew. You know, people would say, I've been through a divorce. I've had an infidelity in my marriage. These things happen in everyday life, and we know who this man is. And overwhelmingly, the American people said, stop the impeachment. This is crazy. It wasn't our elected officials. It wasn't the people. It wasn't the media, because they loved the story. It sold every day. It sold newspapers, magazines. But the collective wisdom, as John said, of the people hearing the truth and knowing that this was wrong, stopped it. In my own case, I know I was taken down to the sheriff's office, just a personal story, my very first day in jail. And he said, if you think anybody cares about what you're doing, you are so wrong. They're vilifying you in the press. You've taken this position, but you ought to just go home and do whatever you have to do to get out of here, because nobody cares. It was probably a week later that they had to hire people in that little jail that I was in to record the letters that came in, not just from around the United States, but from around the world, of people saying, what is going on? Are you okay? 50,000 letters came to that one little jail from people who didn't know me, who knew nothing, but they knew in their heart that something really bad was going on. And I do believe that in the collective wisdom of this woman here who's taking the bus, that we will have our voices heard, and that just as in the impeachment that was stopped, that things will turn around. I do have that hope, because I'm living proof that I was released and that people like you all here today believed in me.
Let me pick up on Susan's point. I happen to have been back in Washington during the impeachment. I spent more time back there for the first time in some 3 decades. I was hired by MSNBC to be an anchor buddy. And I didn't know what an anchor buddy was until I got on the set and found out that what the anchor buddy does is he sits on the set all day while the anchors change. One day it was Brian Williams, or 1 hour, then it would be John Siegenthaler, then Tom Brokaw. And these people, the anchors have earplugs in which they're being given a lot of directions as to who is where that they should throw the program to. And when they don't have anybody out there, they turn to the anchor buddy and expect him to say something intelligent to fill in that dead air. So you have to follow the story closely and stay aware of it. And what became very evident to me after the House, in a very in a totally partisan and unbipartisan fashion, marched like lemmings to a bill of impeachment, was the impact that it was having on the public, who didn't agree with what was happening. The polls showed overwhelmingly that people didn't want this president impeached. But the House went ahead and did it anyway, didn't care. So when it got to the Senate, again, the influence, had there been a different read on the public, he might well have been convicted. Regardless of what arguments he presented, because that is a pure political proceeding. It has a quasi-legal appearance about it. It's pure politics at its rawest. And that Senate wasn't about to ever muster the vote they needed, given the public opinion. So we have that issue today, and most people haven't taken time to understand it, with what's happening with the filibusters that the Democrats are trying to employ to stop Bush from packing the Court of Appeals with these very hard right judges that can influence the lower court and a lot of the federal law. Most decisions never get to the Supreme Court, only a handful. But yet an appellate judge for his circuit, and if there are a lot of light-thinking appellate judges in that circuit, they will make the law for that particular area. And that's what Bush is trying to pack them with. The Democrats have one tool left, and that is their filibuster. And as I have told people, I think if Frist pulls the trigger and causes a nuclear explosion in the Senate, which it will be because of the nuclear fallout, The only remedy that the Democrats have is to say, okay, you break that rule. It's a 200-year practice they're breaking up. You break that practice up, and then we're going to make you comply with every rule. And that's what happens with the slowdown, because the Senate operates by unanimous consent on 99% of its business. But there are lots of rules there, and if the other side makes them comply with the rules, nothing will happen in the Senate, and that could be very beneficial in the next few years.
How did you ever get to be a Republican?
Well, don't criticize John for switching and changing. I've been both a Republican and a Democrat. Yes, ma'am.
Say, for instance, that you could get a third party started. Where would you find the financing for it if you can't use the big corporations? With the cost of elections today, it would be a tremendous thing. Wouldn't we be better off trying to work within the Democratic Party and putting our money and our efforts into that to see if we couldn't find a charismatic leader that could manage us?
I personally think that it's wasted effort because those two parties are controlled by interests that have much more money. But John pointed out something earlier, the advent of the Internet and the blogs. And remember, the MoveOnAmerica.org started from nothing and raised millions of dollars. So there is a source of money there. But it means that people are going to have to act. We're going to have hundreds of thousands of people like you who care. You care enough to come here today and talk about it. We have to have people who will act out a principle, who will ride the bus instead of buying that gallon of gas, who will send money to that Move On America or some internet group that wants a change, that wants a better America, because we can have a better America. I think we have to be optimistic and hope for that. We're going to have to stop here in 2 or 3 minutes. We have two more questions, then we're going to have to stop.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about corporate contributions, or whatever you want to call them. Just prior to the Medicare, that obscene Medicare bill being passed, I became aware of the fact that there were 60 lobbyists for every congressman and senator from the pharmaceutical industry residing in Washington, D.C. 60 lobbyists for each senator and congressman. How do you control that? I just wanted to make that observation. My question has to do with voting machines. There has been a distinct lack of discussion, and I personally have felt, not only in 2002, but certainly in 2004, that there is ample evidence that there were millions of votes that were tampered with. And there's plenty of information from very reliable people online. There are organizations who are looking into all of this. The press refuses to discuss it. I think it will not matter how anyone votes unless that issue is addressed. And obviously the Republicans have a great stake in not having it be addressed, since they're all owned by Diebold and people who are on that side. And I would like some comments from you about whether or not you believe, as I do, that this has been a major factor and it can only get worse if something isn't done about it.
Well, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that one of the two large manufacturers of the voting machine has been a big campaign contributor of George W. Bush. There's legislation that's pending in Congress to provide federal money to the states to provide adequate electronic voting with paper backup, et cetera, et cetera. Now, whether that's ever going to get any place or not, who knows?
There is equal room today to manipulate the vote, if not more, than with electronic voting. Because computers are sort of mysterious black boxes, and their concern of the hacking of those boxes, and the fact that a company like Diebold has so many of them out there, that I'm somewhat troubled that it's an overreaction. Yes, there's probably no question there have been some isolated instances. I don't think trust me, ma'am, I have dug and talked to everybody. I have looked and looked and looked. I've talked to county officials during the election. It just happened that I happened to be promoting Worse Than Watergate in all the swing states. Don't know how they happened to get me in there, but it just did fall that way. And I can't tell you how many voting process people I talked to along the way with this very thing in mind. And they took me to their machines. They showed me how they were sealed. They showed me their boxes. They showed me how, now you can fantasize all kinds of potential problems. I couldn't find them. And so if it's being done, it's one of the cleverest hoaxes that's ever been pulled off. And I don't think people are that clever. I think that sooner or later, these kind of grand conspiracies, they are terribly simplistic answers that really don't come to address the problem. So I don't want to tell you you're wrong, but I can't tell you you're right either, because I'm somebody who has looked firsthand at these machines and talked to the people who bought them and talked to the people who operate them to try to find out how widespread or if this is a problem.
Okay, we have to clear out of here for the next forum in a few minutes, but we have one more question. This gentleman right here.
Excuse me, I was wondering, over the past several months, there seems to be a continuous ongoing in the media of multiple people dying, and it seems to be tremendously drawn in. My thought is, I wondered what happened to the question with my friend Mr. Rumsfeld, who apparently somehow we have 23 secret agencies. I don't know, I can't name but 2 or 3. And I had a security clearance at one time. This man was appointed to control, without congressional oversight, $40 billion. As I understand, perhaps I'm mistaken, I understand $1 million in $1 bills will fill up a minivan. So when you start to project that out, you're talking about a lot of power. That was on the news several months ago. It was a blur. Not many people even heard it. And there has been no further mention, to say nothing of our little war, which has gone from 300 to 400. And if you look at anywhere across the board, any municipal agency, any state agency, any federal agency, at the loss internally has to be better than 30%.
Well,
there's $100 billion just
there,
laying around. We don't know what happened.
well, you're quite right. There's no question many people feel billions have gone here, 10 billion there, 20 billion there, nobody knows where it is, and pretty soon it amounts to some real money. But, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to end this to make room for the next forum. Thank you very much for coming today.
Okay, folks, thank you very much for coming. Please let me...
This event was part of the Palm Springs Book Festival. For more information on the festival, visit their website at psbookfest.com.